That's literally everything I had. My whole life's gone.
We all know the risk every time we get behind the wheel of one of these race cars, but it doesn't make it any easier to see one of your buddies destroy everything he's got and everything he's worked so hard for.
Kamikaze Chris is one of the most recognizable names in American street racing. As a founding cast member of Discovery Channel's Street Outlaws, he built a career on fearlessness, loyalty, and a willingness to push any car to its absolute limit. But behind the adrenaline and the television fame lies a story far more complicated. A story of sacrifice, financial ruin, emotional devastation, and a loss that cut deeper than any race result ever could. In this video, we find out the full truth. The working-class foundation that built a racer. Chris Day grew up in Oklahoma City, in a blue-collar household where money was consistently tight. Speaking about his early years, he has been direct. The family was broke. The clothes he wore as a child were handed down, already worn thin before they reached him. That kind of upbringing shaped everything that came after. Anything beyond basic survival had to be earned personally. And for Chris, that meant working. Mowing lawns, chopping trees, pumping gas, and assisting his father's heating and air conditioning business on weekends became the financing structure behind every racing dream he would eventually pursue. What drove him was not a deep obsession with cars specifically, but competition itself. In interviews over the years, he has described himself as a racing guy rather than a car guy, someone who would race a shopping cart if the stakes were right. That distinction matters. It explains the particular intensity he brought to everything on wheels, from BMX bicycles to dirt bikes in his youth, to the legendary El Camino that would eventually define his public identity. The cars changed. The hunger never did. The roots of his social world in racing ran through a group of Oklahoma City friends who treated street racing as something genuinely serious rather than just a weekend pastime. Among that group were Justin Shearer, better known as Big Chief, and Tyler Pretty, known on the show as Flip. These were not casual acquaintances. Chris and Big Chief spent years working side by side in driveways until 3 or 4 in the morning, building and rebuilding cars, with one of their earliest shared projects being Big Chief's Pontiac Le Mans, known as the Crow. That level of dedication, formed before any television cameras arrived, shaped the brotherhood that audiences would later watch on screen. His own cars came and went, based on whatever finances allowed at the time. A Chevy LUV with a small block engine. A Blazer, a 1971 Chevelle, he still speaks about with visible regret. That Chevelle ran 9s, sat right, and meant something to him in a way that later, more powerful cars never fully replicated. But racing at the level he was drawn to costs money, and money was never abundant. Cars came and went. The commitment to the craft never wavered. When Street Outlaws premiered on the Discovery Channel on June 10, 2013, Chris was part of a world that had already existed for years before the cameras. The show, produced by Pilgrim Studios, followed a group of street racers in Oklahoma City competing for spots on a top 10 list of the fastest street cars in the region. The racing was real. The relationships were real. What television did was give that existing community a national audience. For Chris, it also handed him a platform that brought new pressure alongside new opportunity. The nickname Kamikaze, earned through years of driving at the outermost edge of control, suddenly meant something far beyond the local strip. He has described his approach behind the wheel as living in what he called the jackass range, that razor-thin space where most people would slam on the brakes, but where he somehow found complete clarity. It wasn't that he wanted danger. In a strange way, danger was where the noise disappeared. While others searched for peace in quiet moments, Chris found it at high speeds, balancing on the edge between control and catastrophe. That mindset made him uniquely suited for the Elco, a machine with a story far heavier than its metal frame suggested. Because this wasn't just another race car. It carried history, tragedy, and the shadow of a man who never got to see its full potential. And what happened next is something you'll want to stay for, because the legacy hidden inside this car changed everything. The car that carried a dead man's legacy. To understand what Kamikaze Chris lost, it is necessary to understand what the Elco actually was and where it came from. The car was a 1980 Chevrolet El Camino. Before Chris ever sat in the driver's seat, it belonged to the world of Tyler "Flip" Pretty, one of the founding members of the 405 Street Racing Brotherhood and a central cast member in the first season of Street Outlaws. Tyler Pretty was born in Chickasha, Oklahoma, and was well known in the Oklahoma City racing scene long before the show existed. He, Big Chief, and Kamikaze Chris had grown up together in the same orbit, bound by the same obsession with speed and competition. Flip drove the El Camino as something that barely held together, assembled from discarded parts and running on nitrous, the kind of car that should have been slower than it was. It regularly beat vehicles with far more sophisticated builds. The car reflected Flip's personality, unconventional, unpredictable, and consistently more dangerous than it appeared. In 2013, Tyler Pretty died at home at the age of 31. The circumstances surrounding his death were never publicly disclosed. His family and friends requested privacy, and no official cause was released. His passing happened after the first season had been filmed, and it sent a shock through the 405 community that viewers felt through the screen. When the car became available, Big Chief offered it to Chris. He bought it immediately. Taking ownership of that car was not simply a business transaction for a useful racing machine. It was an act of loyalty. Every modification Chris made from that point forward carried the weight of a tribute. He took the car that had been pieced together from junk and spent years and his own savings transforming it into something capable of competing at the highest level of street racing. The original nitrous setup was eventually replaced entirely. In December 2017, the car debuted a new twin-turbo configuration using twin-precision turbo 94mm Gen 2 Pro Mod units, capable of producing approximately 3,500 horsepower through a heavily modified drivetrain. The investment was not just mechanical. Every rebuild, every late night in the garage, every dollar extracted from his heating and airwork and fed back into the car was a continuation of something that had started with someone who could no longer continue it. That context transformed the Elco from a vehicle into a symbol, not for the audience, not primarily, for Chris himself. He has said explicitly that the car represented everything he had in his whole life. That statement was not exaggeration for television purposes. He carried that weight into every race. The car still had a stock front suspension, a 117-inch factory wheelbase, and a 62.5-inch drive shaft. Nothing about its geometry made it suitable for the power levels it was producing. Chris raced it anyway, repeatedly, because the point was never purely to optimize the machine. The point was to honor who it came from by keeping it competitive, and by doing so in a way that reflected how Flip had originally driven it, with full commitment and no margin for error. The night the Elco died. In 2020, on a night that Chris Day has since described as one he did not even intend to race, the Elco was destroyed. The crash happened during filming of Street Outlaws. The episode aired in February 2021, though the incident itself had occurred months before. Chris lost control of the Elco while racing, and the car left the roadway and crashed in front of the Discovery Channel cameras. The damage was catastrophic. The body was gone. The chassis was gone. The engine was destroyed. The turbochargers were gone. Virtually everything that made the car what it was had been eliminated in a single incident. Standing in the wreckage afterward, Chris described the car as everything he had in his whole life. That footage became one of the most discussed moments in Street Outlaws history, not because of the spectacle of the crash, but because of the visible grief of the man standing next to what remained. For fans who had watched him rebuild this car from a collection of salvaged parts into a 3,500 horsepower twin-turbo machine, and who understood the human story connected to it, The scene carried a weight that went far beyond television drama. The financial damage was severe. Years of savings poured into an already difficult build were gone in a single moment. Chris had always operated without the resources of the wealthier teams on the show. There was no sponsor infrastructure to fall back on. There was no rebuild fund waiting somewhere. His work in the heating and air business had been the financial engine behind the car for years, and even that had limits. After the crash, he was starting over with almost nothing. What followed showed a different kind of resilience. Rather than disappearing, he reached out to his fan base. He auctioned off the Weld racing wheel, Mickey Thompson tire, and TBM brake rotor that had been sheared from the passenger side of the Elco during the crash, each signed through an eBay listing that received over 100 bids and climbed past $10,000 within days. He offered to cook a steak dinner in his racing suit for whoever took the auction above $25,000. The humor was real, but so was the desperation beneath it. By February 2021, he had announced a path forward. Using what remained of the Elco's engine, transmission, and drivetrain components that survived the crash, he began building a black C5 Corvette as the replacement vehicle. The new car echoed the Elco in its flat black appearance and its rejection of the expensive, purpose-built aesthetic that dominated the competition around him. It was still the same statement wrapped in different sheet metal. The underdog was not finished. The loss of the Elco, however, was never something that could be measured by repair costs, replacement parts, or the time it would take to build another race car. What disappeared in that crash was far more personal. The car had carried memories, history, and a bond to Tyler Pretty that stretched far beyond the racetrack. For years, it had served as a rolling reminder of someone whose absence could never truly be filled. When the Elco was destroyed, it forced a painful realization that some things cannot be rebuilt, no matter how much determination or money is invested. And as the dust settled, the crash began revealing something much bigger than the loss of a vehicle. Keep watching till the very end, because what this tragedy exposed about everything he had built may be the most emotional part of the story. What the crash revealed about everything he had built. The destruction of the Elco forced a reckoning that went beyond the technical challenge of acquiring and building a replacement car. It made public something that Chris had always been candid about privately. The financial foundation of his racing had always been precarious. He had spoken openly over the years about periods during the show when he was, in his own words, dirt broke poor. Street Outlaws was never a show that made all its cast members wealthy. The show provided exposure and, in some cases, income from appearances and merchandise. But the cost of maintaining competitive race cars at the level required for the show consistently outpaced those returns for drivers without corporate sponsors or inherited wealth. Chris ran on savings, labor, and loyalty from a small group of people who believed in what he was doing. The Elco crash stripped away the product of years of that investment in a single evening. It also stripped away the psychological buffer that the car represented. As long as the Elco was running, there was something tangible to point to, something that proved the sacrifice had been worth it. After the crash, what remained was a pile of wreckage, a debt-free but resource-depleted man, and the question of what came next. His community responded with genuine support. The eBay auction demonstrated that the connection between Kamikaze Chris and the Street Outlaws audience was real, in a way that translated into action. Fans who had watched him rebuild Flip's car for years were not passive observers. They showed up when it mattered. That response shaped the direction of the rebuild. The community-supported effort to fund a new chassis continued into 2025 and 2026, with Chris working toward a small tire platform that would allow him to return to competition without requiring the same level of capital the Elco had eventually demanded. The C5 Corvette project took longer than anyone expected. The car went through multiple stages of development, with updates shared across his social media platforms and discussed in the broader Street Outlaws community for years. The twin-turbo Corvette was still not complete in its final competition configuration as of 2024, with the build stretched across a longer timeline than a well-funded operation would have required. That extended timeline was itself a reflection of the same financial reality that had always defined his racing. What Chris revealed through all of this was that the thing he had lost was not really a car. The car was replaceable, technically speaking. What the crash exposed was the degree to which his entire identity in the racing world had been bound up in that specific vehicle and the story it carried. The Elco was grief turned into horsepower, loyalty shaped in steel, and a legacy sustained through every rebuild. Losing it was not losing a machine. It was losing the most tangible form of something that mattered in a way that mechanics alone cannot explain. He has remained clear-eyed about who he is and where he came from throughout this process. The all-or-nothing description of his personality, first shared in an interview years before the crash, remains the most accurate summary of how he operates. There is no middle ground in his approach to racing, to loss, or to comeback. Whether that quality ultimately carries him back into competition at the level he reached with the Elco remains to be seen. What it has already produced is a story of a working-class man from Oklahoma City who poured everything he had into honoring a dead friend, lost it all in one night on camera, and then got back to work the following morning. There is also something instructive in how his absence from the screen was received. When Kamikaze Chris disappeared from regular Street Outlaws appearances as his rebuild stretched across months and then years, the audience noticed. Fan communities dedicated to the show kept track of updates. His social media following stayed engaged across the timeline of the Corvette build, responding to progress reports with the kind of sustained attention that most television personalities only receive during active broadcasts. That loyalty was not built by a television character. It was built by a real person who had been visibly vulnerable on camera, in a way that felt honest rather than performed. The grief he showed standing next to the wrecked Elco was not the kind of emotion that gets manufactured for ratings. Racing fans, who are generally skeptical of reality television drama, recognized it as genuine because it connected directly to something they already knew about the story: that this man had spent years rebuilding a dead friend's car from nothing, and that the car carried a meaning that no camera crew had created and no producer had scripted. When it was destroyed, what you saw on screen was someone processing a real loss in real time. That specific quality, the transparency about cost and sacrifice, separates Chris from many of the personalities that street racing television has produced over the past decade. His journey does not come across as aspirational in the typical entertainment sense. Nobody watches his story and thinks they could do the same thing easily. They watch it and recognize the weight of a choice made repeatedly over many years: to put everything into something that might not pay off, because the alternative is to not try at all. The question of whether the Corvette build eventually produces the same kind of results the Elco produced at its peak matters less than it might appear to. Chris has already demonstrated through the length and difficulty of the rebuild that the motivation was never primarily about winning races. If it were purely about winning, he would have walked away from a car with stock front suspension geometry and a 62.5-inch drive shaft long before 2020. He stayed because the car represented something beyond its race results. And when it was gone, he started building the next thing for the same reason. The street racing world has always been about more than speed. At its core, the culture that gave birth to Street Outlaws was built on loyalty, sacrifice, and the refusal to accept that limited resources meant limited potential. Kamikaze Chris has lived that idea more literally than almost anyone else in the franchise. The car is gone. The rebuild continues. And the story of why he lost it all turns out to be the same story as why he keeps going. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.